I want to talk, about that thematic idea about the difference between the model programs, the high quality programs that we've done lots of research on that tell us, yes, if kids go to these programs, they're going to get lots of positive developmental benefits. I want to compare that to what we actually see on the ground, and I call that everyday programs, right? It's the programs that are out there running today that many of you might be involved in observational research studies. You might be going to visit. We don't get to randomly allocate children to programs. We don't get to say, well, only teach this curriculum or that curriculum. This is just what's happening in the field. And so I want to look at what's the divide between the two, right? And what I want to set that up to say is that there is a gap between the promise of high quality programs that have been through these research studies and the everyday programs that we observe on the ground. So I have to set up a few assumptions, and these are the bits where perhaps sometimes you might disagree, hopefully not this side of the room, but I'm happy for you to put this in your top pocket and ask me at the end or declare a different position on this. But I think that one of the things we assume is true is that if we have high quality early childhood programs and children get access to them, they are effective mechanisms to reduce inequality. And only because I don't have my notes with me, I've put my notes on the slide, which is bad form, I know. But there I've said, we can look in the research, and like I said, we've done enough of this research, I think, to know this is pretty true. But the effect sizes are, in the range of 0.4 to 1 standard deviation on a range of cognitive developmental outcomes. And I've put peri-preschool up there because that's kind of one of the go-to studies that we all cite when we say that, when children from vulnerable backgrounds get into programs, there is a positive benefit and it is sustained. I think there's an interesting literature and debate about whether high-quality early learning programs reduce inequality, narrow the gap, or whether they close the gap, this socio-economic status gradient, whether kids can actually catch up to their more advantaged peers. This Duncan and Sojourner paper from 2013 makes the case that, actually, if we carefully measure this stuff, we can close SES-related gaps on cognitive measures, at least, in the short term. Whether that's true of all programs, I don't know. I don't know because this is this issue of everyday ECEC programs. And the literature on these is much different, right? In fact, there are many studies out there that will declare the childcare sector delivers 0 benefits to children, right? They don't gain any learning and development outcomes for participating in the program. Or the effect is very, very small. This is a spoiler for later. I'm going to show you a study I did in Australia where for participating in a year of programs, kids were getting an extra month of development, right? 1 month, And so there is this contrast between the experimental programs or the high-quality model programs and what we see in everyday programs operating in the field. And I've already done this bit, but the way I'm going to talk about it is that we need to know something about the availability of these programs, how families access them, and the level of quality. And actually, I've had some really interesting discussions with the research group here who are doing amazing work in quality. But this becomes the kind of paradigm we're working in where we want to know what is it about differential access to high-quality programs that means we're seeing this gap where children aren't getting the benefits that are promised by the model programs. And I'm going to make that case perhaps not helpful for you folks here, but through some research I've done in Australia, 2 studies, the effective early experiences, I don't know what the 4th E is anymore, but that's the study that Gord alluded to. This helpful link here is the final report of this study. We'll make the slides available if you want them. Certainly you can email me. So don't feel like you've got to copy that down. But this is a nice document that summarises 10 years of research, and I'd encourage you to get in and have a look at it. This is my new study in New South Wales in Australia, the Overcoming Disadvantage in Early Childhood study. There we're looking at how different levels of quality of program influence children's oral language ability. And I'm going to show you a study that I'm doing with UNICEF in Indonesia in a place called Bogor. Who has been there? No? Oh. I'd never been there until I worked there. It's south of Jakarta. I'll show you a map later on. But there we're doing a longitudinal study where we look at children's learning and development in 5 developmental outcomes: executive function, motor, social and emotional, literacy and numeracy, and looking at how investments in early learning programs can support kids' development outcomes. Any questions on what I'm going to cover? Anyone disagree with the articles of faith? No? Good?
Perhaps then we could a little bit define what is the exercise, because I'm not sure that everyone understands this part.
Yeah.
I think it's important.
Yeah. So the comment quite reasonably is describe what an effect size is. And I was having some conversations at dinner about exactly this in the meta-analytic literature. It's inconsistent is the answer. But as a rule of thumb, what we can assume that to mean is for a 1 standard deviation change in some input, like increasing quality by 1 standard deviation, we get a 0.4 to 1 standard deviation change in the outcome, which is often a cognitive domain or an academic domain like literacy and numeracy. What is true, though, is sometimes that isn't true. Sometimes it's about how much change in the outcome do you get for going from no program to some program, or from low quality to high quality. Certainly the peri-preschool studies were about whether you got into the program or not. And in fact, I have a nice little blurb about that. So again, if you tweet me or send me an email, I'll send you a little lit review on this, which is kind of nice, I guess. It'll make your assignments easier, right? Okay. So the previous slide was about setting up this idea that there is a difference between the model programs we look at that are highly effective everyday programs that we observe. This one is now just setting up that we have some evidence that suggests that differences between children in terms of their learning and development outcomes emerge early. So again, I'll open it up to the group. Does anyone disagree with that idea that gaps between children influenced by socio-economic status emerge early? Okay, good. We're all one team here. That's nice. I'm going to show you an example. So I love this picture, right? But one of my colleagues in Melbourne says I should stop showing it because it is too complex and people don't understand it. So I'm going to spend a couple of minutes going through it. I've got some animations and things like that too. And if at the end you still don't understand it, I promise I'll never show it to a group again. But what I've plotted here is the relationship between children's verbal ability, that's this y-axis here, from low ability to high ability, and children's age in months, right? Nobody should be surprised here that as children get older, their verbal ability goes up. Right? We have a positive slope, a positive gradient in this plot. The black dots in the middle here are the normative development trajectory. This is what we expect children to be at these ages. And the grey error bars represent a standard deviation around that level of ability for each age group, right? So this is the track that we expect children to follow as their verbal ability increases. I've broken up some actual data we collected in the field into 5 groups, and this is this baseline quintile group, and said, what is the average trajectory of children in the first quintile, right? This is just the first quintile of development. Who were the lowest achievers when we met them when they were around 3 to 4 years old, relative to the second, third, fourth and fifth quintiles. The only thing I really want you to take out of this is the development trajectory of children who were the highest achievers when we met them when they were 3 to 4. They start above the expected level of ability, the black dots, and they continue to be there, right, all the way through till they're about 8 years old. This is the development trajectory of the lowest achievers when we met them when they were 3 years old. They start around the expected level of ability for their age. But by the time they're 8 years old, they're right on the edge of the lower bound of our expectation around their abilities. And in fact, I would argue the difference between these trajectories has got wider, right? So this plot is just making the case that, we all believe that developmental differences can emerge early. And in fact, they compound. So children, when we meet them when they're 3 and 4, they're a bit more clustered together. 3 years later, when we haven't done anything, this is observational data, the children in that lowest development group are already well behind their peers. And I'm going to say later that we should probably do something around this age rather than waiting for that gap to emerge. Did that make sense? Great, I can keep the slide. Another little setup piece, and that is that these differences that we see emerging early, they persist over time. They don't magically close up once kids get into secondary school. I'm going to move through this one quite quickly because the evidence here is a little bit weaker. I'm going to show you an example from Australia using PISA data, the OECD's international study. Are people familiar with it?
Yeah.
Do people love PISA?
Yeah.
I saw one of these, yeah. It's a controversial study in some circles. I love it. But the reason I wanted to put this slide up actually is this Ed Hanishak paper, MBR working paper 25648, catchy title. I read this today. Gord, have you read it? Well, you have to. This is the title. This is a study that came out. I only read it today. It's a study on. The title is something like the persistent socioeconomic status gradient and achievement in the USA, and they review a bunch of studies and say it's true over 50 years. Differences between children that are caused by socioeconomic status have been constant, right? That they haven't closed. And they make the argument that some of the papers that argue that the gap has widened are perhaps overstating things. If you love dry, quantitative, statistical papers, go and download it. It's a great read. But the point I wanted to make here is that certainly differences between children don't miraculously disappear. And to make the case, I have put this slide together, and by that I mean copied and pasted it out of a PISA report. But see, it's cited down here, so it's okay. But this is the trend in reading literacy for PISA in Australia from 2000 through to 2015. And each of these lines represent the quartiles of socioeconomic status. So 2 things in this slide that's important. 1, there is a real gap in the ability of children from different socioeconomic status backgrounds. PISA is done when children are 15. And it certainly, over time, is not a trend that is diminishing. And for the Australian policy people who perhaps might be watching on Facebook Live, there's a bit of a negative trend here. So, we're a bit worried about that as well. But the point I'm trying to make here is that, these differences are persistent. They're not being reduced over time. And the reason why I want to say that, and I'm going to put a caveat on this, in Australia we did a really big reform of the early childhood sector in 2009. The children who were attending preschool programs in 2009 have not got old enough to have participated in the PISA study yet. So it might be true that in the next couple of years all those lines merge together because high quality programs are closing that gap and this whole presentation has to go in the bin. I'm not sure. But we have this persistent problem. There are differences between different groups of children and the groups are a function of family SES. Okay, I think I've done enough setting up now. Is everyone on board with me? Okay, so I'm kind of making the argument, we believe that early childhood programs are effective when they're high quality and available and kids go for enough hours. But when we look at the sector as a whole, we're not seeing this massive narrowing of developmental gaps, right? There are persistent differences between children and they are a function of the advantage or disadvantages of the houses or the communities they live in. And everyone believes me, right? Yeah, of course. So now I'm going to show you some evidence from Australia. I think the bit here that I really want to reinforce is, I'm very aware that the Canadian context and the Australian context are not the same. One of the things I'm really hoping there'll be lots of questions and discussions about later is all counterexamples you have here about effective programs and different kinds of systems and, potentially some solutions I can take back home and write policy papers about. But I'm going to show you some evidence from these three studies. The first is this effective early experiences study, and I have, again, forgotten what the fourth E is. There's 4 E's, hence E for kids. But this is a study that we started in 2010 in Australia, in 4 locations. So I've marked them here. Melbourne, that's where I'm from. Who's been? Oh, some people. Yeah, that's great. A regional site in Shepparton, Brisbane, which is another metropolitan site, and a remote community in Mount Isa. The study was a random sample of children from centres. We randomly drew centres and took all the children who were participating in them who were preschool age. What we didn't do was randomly draw centres from the whole country. We had to choose some 4 sites, 4 strata to work in. And the reason we did that is, as you probably know, Australia's a big place. And if we randomly sample a centre in Kalgoorlie, we have to fly someone 4 hours to Perth and then 3 hours to Kalgoorlie to visit one centre. And we didn't have that much money or resource. I'm sure that's a common experience in Canada in doing research, right? It's a big country, big spaces. Getting representative samples is challenging. But we ended up with about 2,500 kids, preschool-age children, in family daycare sites. So that's care provided at a person's home. Childcare centres, long day care centres we call them. They're for 0 to 6-year-old children mostly. Full day programs, although not many kids go full day. Not many kids go every day of the week. Kindergarten programs, but when I say kindergarten, I don't mean kindergarten like here, I mean for 4-year-olds. So it's not in the schools. It's like a pre-K program, I guess. And because we followed the kids longitudinally for 5 years, we followed them from these programs into school, right? And the things we were measuring, I hope I've got a slide next that summarises them, are how many hours were kids going for, what type of programs were they in, what was the quality of the programs, and I promise I'll talk about what I think quality is next, And then we also looked at their learning and development outcomes. So we had a range of cognitive measures using the Woodcock-Johnson 3, which is a cognitive assessment battery. But we also have a national assessment program for literacy and numeracy run in schools. All children do it. So by the time children got to grade 3, 5 years into the study, we also had their school achievement data. Good. So our measure of quality in this study was this measure here, the classroom assessment scoring system. And I know many of you have heard about it because it's popular here. Who has heard about it? Great. Who has used it? Who loves it? Oh, wow. Okay, lots. For those of us who haven't used it, what the class is it's a measure of interactions between adults and children, right? And the idea behind it is that it is kind of agnostic to what context children are in. It doesn't matter if it's a family-based program, a centre-based program, a preschool program or childcare. It can be used in any time of the day. So you can use it at meal times, when children are sitting down to lunch. You can use it when a teacher is doing a group reading exercise. You can do it while children are playing together in a dramatic play corner. And it's all driven behind this model that it's those interactions between adults and children that support learning and development. So it's a kind of classic teaching concept, the idea that through interaction with people and symbols and objects in environments, children acquire new knowledge, skills and abilities, and we can scaffold them to acquire particular skills more quickly than if we just leave them to their own devices. The class measures 3 things, and I hope I have some nice animations here. Emotional support, this is the first thing that it measures. It has 4 indicators that tell us about the emotional support in a classroom. And it's really focused on how do educators meet the emotional needs of children, the social and emotional needs of children in classrooms. So positive and negative climate are kind of self-explanatory. It's the positive affect, warmth and attitude towards children, and on the other side, the absence of sarcasm and physical discipline. But it also includes these elements that are about teachers being sensitive to children's needs. So are they supporting children in place as they need it to go about play? And are they integrating children's perspectives into the everyday program? The next thing it measures is classroom organisation, which is really about how productive is the classroom, how much time on task is done, or conversely, how much behavioural management has to go on to keep things going. Do children know the rules? Can they move quickly through different transitions? Or is there a lot of standing around, not knowing what to do, a lot of lost time? And importantly, do educators support children through many modes of education, small groups, big groups, different curriculum materials? Or is it all just sitting down on the mat and listening to a story? I say that because that's kind of the example from Australia. I don't know if that's consistent here. Sit down, legs crossed, hands on head. The third thing that the class measures is instructional support. And I'll be honest, this is where the focus of most of my work is. This is the classic measure of teaching quality. It's about whether educators support children to be exposed to and learn about new concepts. It's about whether they use effective feedback to support and extend children's knowledge and understanding, and whether they model higher order language in the classroom. You can see there's nothing in here about, are there colouring in sheets for every child? Is there a seat for every child? Is there a roof over the room? There's nothing in here about the physical environment. There's very little, perhaps except for instructional learning formats, about curriculum materials. This is all about interactions, and so is entirely consistent with this idea that it's not dependent on a particular learning environment. You know, it doesn't have to be in a school setting to use this. One of the things we kind of assume, though, is that these different aspects of quality are going to influence different learning outcomes differentially, right? We shouldn't expect that because educators do a really good job at supporting children's social and emotional needs, that will necessarily mean that their writing competency goes through the roof, right? And similarly, because the educator does a really effective job at supporting children's learning, perhaps oral language development, that they're going to therefore develop competencies around self-regulation, negotiating difficult contexts or conflicts or things like that. So we have to sort of think about how do different levels of quality in each of these domains influence different learning outcomes differentially. And again, I hope I've got a slide about this right next. Great, I do. This is the second time in Canada I've shown this slide, and it's going to be the second time that I thank Gord for making this. This is some analysis we did on the class in Australia. So keeping in mind that in this study, we had a representative sample of services. So I'm going to take the heroic leap and say, this is the level of quality we observed in Australia. This is the quality of Australian services. These are box plots. So the class measure goes from low, 1, to 7, high. The lines in the middle of these boxes are the median, the most observed, the midpoint of the measure. So this is the average level of instructional support in Australian programs. The box itself covers 50% of the distribution of programs, right? So this is where the majority of classrooms are in Australia in those three domains. And these these whiskers here represent, well, they actually represent 1.5 times the interquartile range. But let's just say this is the variance, the range of observed scores that we see in Australian programs from lowest to highest. And these dots here represent outliers, which we consider kind of weird cases. The only thing that I really want you to take out of this, because I'm going to start talking about children's cognitive development in a minute, is that the middle 50% of classrooms in Australia for instructional support are in the low range. This dotted line is the demarcation between low and moderate quality. And in fact, we didn't observe a single program in Australia that demonstrated high quality for instructional support. And so for the class team up here, I'm looking forward to hearing about how Canadian programs and local programs differ. Emotional support is the exact opposite, right? So instead, the middle 50% of programs are ranging from moderately high to high quality, right? In Australia, we do an excellent job of supporting the social and emotional needs of children in our early childhood programs. Classroom organisation, we're a bit more middling on, but still quite good. Here's a real gap for us, right? Does anyone want to jump in and tell me about services here in Montreal? Do we see this kind of pattern?
It's the same.
Yeah?
Yes.
Yeah. See, we are colonial brothers and sisters. So this is kind of just a setup on what I'm going to talk about later. I just want you to keep this in mind, and it sounds like you're very familiar with this pattern, so that's good. So now I guess it's time to look at some of the other outcomes, and the first thing I want to talk about is a study I did quite a long time ago, which said how localised are early childhood education and care markets, right? And by that I mean, do we see lots of evidence of families going, oh, the quality program I want is across town, so I'm going to drive across town every morning to get the right level of quality for me? Or is what we see that people just go to the local centre that's around the corner from them, or near to work, or perhaps near the school that their other children attend? All the nodding says, I think you guys already know the answer to this one. Yeah. So I get this in Australia too. I show this slide, I do this talk, and people say, well, we knew that. Of course we knew that. And I say, yeah, but I put numbers to it, so that's better. But so one of the first things I did when I was starting to think about how effective is the Australian early childhood system is to say, well, you know, if we're going to say that there's some gradient for quality, and by that I either mean that in less advantaged neighbourhoods there's lower quality, or that families from less advantaged backgrounds on average get lower quality programs, then it kind of has to be true that families aren't showing lots of evidence of doing lots of travel to get to programs, right? And so that's what this is. Here is a distribution of the distance that families drive to their early childhood provider. I've normalised it to be percentages. But the interesting thing here is that, and I always forget the numbers, so I have to write it up here. More than 50% of trips to early childhood programs less than 3 kilometres, and more than 75% are less than 6 kilometres. Australian neighbourhoods are on average about 9 square kilometres, right? And so I use this slide to sort of say, well, most families just go to programs in their local neighbourhood. And everyone goes, yes, of course, we already knew that. But this is an important thing to set up before we talk about the next couple of slides, because if this is not true, then it's hard to talk about the segregation of quality within neighbourhoods of different levels of advantage. And that's what I'm going to kind of make the case for next. In this study, I was quite lucky because it was a longitudinal study. I could actually go back and ask these families who were travelling 30 and 40 kilometres to get to programs. I'm not very bright, so I couldn't understand why anyone would do that.
Because they have daycare on their job.
Yeah. Well, yeah, see, I mean, you guys needed to be with me in Melbourne, so I didn't have to call all these parents to work out what was going on. But yeah, it's exactly right. So those families were driving from the outer suburbs into the city to work, and the childcare centre was in the city. It took me 2 years of a PhD program to work that out. Okay, so we've set up that idea that families are mostly attending programs in their local neighbourhoods. So then what I kind of wanted to know was, well, is the level of quality different by different quintiles of neighbourhood SES? So in Australia, we have this great measure of community socio-economic status called the Socio-Economic Index for Areas, Index of Relative Socio-Economic Advantage and Disadvantage. And they catchily give it the acronym CFA-ERSAD. I hope you have a better one, right? But it puts together lots of different measures of SES, the unemployment rate in the local neighbourhood, incomes, the size of the household, the number of bedrooms in an average house. There's some stuff in there around crime rates. There's around 19 or 20 indicators all up. And what I could do is say, well, let's draw the distribution of instructional support quality in the least advantaged neighbourhoods right through to the most advantaged neighbourhoods. And again, I hope I have written the effect size in here. Do people believe me when I say there is a trajectory here? Is anyone surprised by this? Yeah, again, I think most people know this intuitively. But there's a couple, that's a point I need to come to in a minute. Let's not muddy the waters. So we've got this positive trajectory, but what I've done here is also put in this boundary, which I say is the gap between low quality and moderate quality. And while it's true that there is this trend, it is also true to say that even in the most affluent neighbourhoods, most programs are falling into that lower range, right? We're not seeing huge quality, even in the most affluent neighbourhoods. And so the difference is quite marginal. And there was an interesting paper put out by, I think, Peg Burchnell. If not, she just got a free citation, that said that, in fact, in the US, they weren't seeing any relationship between the quality of programs and children's learning until instructional support was here, right? And the difference between a program that was in this range versus one that was in that range, so from here, the sort of 0 range to the effective range, was an effect size of 0.17 to 0.35 standard deviations. So children's learning and development was going up by about 0.2 to 0.3 of a standard deviation if you could move quality from here to here. And what's interesting about that is how few programs actually operate in everyday markets, in the everyday early childhood sector at that range, right? Effectively none, as far as I'm concerned. So that's another thing to keep in mind when we're talking about how effective is the everyday early childhood. So the previous couple of slides were saying, okay, we've got this evidence in Australia that we do have income segregation, SES segregation of quality. I did spoil it a bit by sort of saying that it's true that, and again, you might be not surprised to hear this, but families tend to be lower SES and live in lower SES communities. It's kind of what defines them, right? It's not always true. I mean, it's certainly true that some affluent people live in less advantaged neighbourhoods, and some less affluent families live in quite advantaged neighbourhoods. But on average, families from more vulnerable backgrounds tend to live in lower SES neighbourhoods. And so with that knowledge that we have this quality gradient, we want to know something about what are children's experiences of quality. This is another one of these plots that my colleagues don't love that I think is really good. But here, this is the longitudinal exposure to quality. So here is when we meet children in this study when they're 3 and 4, and then we watch the quality of programs for 3 years. And this is the mean experience of quality for children from, the dark line is low SES, the slightly less grey line is moderate SES, and these are the highest SES families. And so what's interesting here, and again I hope I've annotated it for my benefit, is that the biggest differential in the experience of quality for children is when they're youngest, right? So when children are 3 and 4, the difference in the average level of quality that is experienced is most pronounced. And in fact, by the time children are 5 and 6, which in Australia is when they start school, that quality is bunching up. Similar experience here? Have you done classwork in schools?
We don't have information about quality.
Oh, well, here's a future study. All right. This is interesting. Anyway, I mean, the conclusion I'm going to draw about this and where I'm going to go is that there is an imperative to work on quality in programs that are working with the youngest age children, not just because we think that these developmental differences emerge early and that's the time to work on them, but because that's where the gap is for children, particularly vulnerable children. Okay, so that's a really long setup. For probably what we're really interested in to say, okay, given all these facts we know about the distribution of quality in everyday programs and the different use of everyday programs, what sort of impact do they have on kids' learning and development? This is another one of these slides my colleagues say stop showing. Are there any structural equation people in here? One, yes. All right, so this is just for you. The only reason I want to put this up is because this reminds me to talk about some of the assumptions that we're modelling. So if you think back to that slide that shows children's learning and development going up on average over time. That's what we're modelling. What is children's growth over time? And some things that influence children's learning and development we assume to be constant, and that's these things. So the home environment, family SES, and child traits like temperament. Statisticians like me tend to say these things are fixed and they don't change from year to year. People don't believe me when I say that, and it's probably not really true, but it is a convenient statistical device to make these models more simple. So come on a journey with me and just know that in what I'm going to show you next, we're assuming these kinds of things are constant, right? They have an influence on where children start and where they grow to, but that effect is constant whether they're 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 or 8. What is changing over time, however, is the quality of programs, right? Because children in Australia, when we meet them when they're 3, are often in long daycare centres. Then lots of them make a transition into kindergarten, and then lots of them transition into school. So the only other thing I want you to take out of this, and I'm sorry I showed this, is that we are assuming that the quality of the programs is changing over time. I've put this up like this, but this is actually incorrect. I let the quality that children experience in the first year when we meet them influence their learning right now and next year and the year after that. But what I don't let happen is the quality the child experiences 3 years later when they're in school can't come back in time magically and influence their learning now, right? So we're trying to be consistent about the temporal chain of effects. And I won't show that slide anymore, I promise. So I did have a big table of regressions in here, but I took it out and just tried to summarise it. And this is what I was saying earlier. So in this study in Australia, where we had a representative sample of children, where we think we have a really good estimate of what is the true level of quality in terms of instructional support, emotional support, and classroom organisation, we see that children get, for a year of participating in programs, about a month of growth in verbal ability. So that's when we move instructional support from the mean, from the average, up 1 standard deviation, right? It's also true that when children get more hours of program, they get more learning and development outcomes, their growth is bigger. And these patterns are fairly consistent for both verbal ability, so that's a lot around vocab and speaking and listening, but it's also similar for pre-mathematics. And I hope what follows is the big but slide. But this part here is completely swamped by SES, right? Families from high SES backgrounds get a 1.5 month advantage over their peers, right? So just for coming from a high SES family, you're already more than the growth that we're attributing to quality ahead of your peers, right? That's at the start of the study. Children who live in high SES neighbourhoods get 3 months of growth over the duration of the study, right? 3 times the effect of quality. So just going to a centre in a high SES area gives children both a boost at the start of the study and faster growth over time. I can't remember what the exact number for this is, but 3 months growth on the slope term, on the growth effect, over 3 years is 9 months of development, right? So by the end of the study, by just being in more affluent neighbourhoods, children are way, way ahead of their peers, right? Now, I hope what everyone is sitting here saying is, well, it's not the neighbourhood that is doing that, right? There's nothing intrinsically about the neighbourhood that's feeding to children's learning and development. This is likely a strong selection effect, right? This is the fact that children who live in these neighbourhoods come from neighbourhoods with many more resources, right? Perhaps less stress, better library, more programs being run, families who are making different choices about the quality of programs, the hours of programs they're in. And the challenge here is when we're observing programs, when we're looking at everyday programs, we have to disentangle this from this, right? And really the reason why we put all this stuff in these models, apart from the fact that I'm interested in it, is to try and get a more pure measure of what is the effect of quality on children's learning and development outcomes. Because we know that trajectory for quality exists within neighbourhoods. If we don't think about this, we're going to quite unrealistically attribute it to the quality, right? And we're going to come out with a figure that says, isn't it great? Quality of programs is driving all this learning and development for kids, and we have a highly effective system. But we don't. We followed these kids for 5 years. The previous slide was about the first 3 years of development we observed. We then watched these kids come into school. Our national testing program is called NAPLAN, the National Assessment Program for Literacy and Numeracy. And this is the distribution of spelling scores for two groups of children, those who had low verbal ability when we finished the third year of the study, and those that had high verbal ability when we finished the third year of the study. The effect size for this is 1.5 standard deviations, which is 2 bands, which is about half a year of development on this measure. So the children who were from the most vulnerable backgrounds, who had the lowest verbal ability on average, when we finished measuring their cognitive trajectories, we then picked up this measure of their age 8 school spelling development, and we see this really quite large effect, right? So this is coming back to what I was saying earlier about these effects being persistent, perhaps growing over time, and what we saw was really strong differences in children. And these groups are, of course, we know, strongly correlated with SES. And I don't think I've put in the parameter for SES, but that's fine. Okay, so that's that one study. And I am very aware that it is now 8:15. So I'm going to zoom through 5 more slides and then finish up. There's another study I'm doing in New South Wales. It's an area that has a lot of issues around disadvantage. And one of the things that we did look at E4Kids but didn't do a close analysis of is when children are 4 years old in Australia, they are entitled to 15 hours of kindergarten. But what we did in this really disadvantaged area is ask the families, what time do you go in the morning and what time do you pick up your kid? And what we got was this distribution of hours a week for 2 groups. One is a control group and one is a treatment group. Doesn't matter. But what we see is if we look at where 15 hours is, in fact, 30% of children are not getting the statutory minimum that they're entitled to in Australia that is funded by the federal government. And those of you who hang around later to have a chat, I'll talk to you about why that is, because I actually went and asked the centres if they're getting funded for this. Why is it that they're not opening their doors and getting the kids in? And there's a really interesting answer to that, but it will take me 10 minutes to tell you, so you don't get it as part of the presentation. I just really like this slide. So we did another study in Indonesia. It's still going. We're in our 3rd year now. Again, we were looking at how a whole bunch of different family SES indicators influence the use of different childcare programs and the outcomes of children. This is really interesting. So this is a really simple measure of the home learning environment. We just ask parents, do you have any children's books, right? And because Indonesia is a developing country, we say this can be books that you make yourself, right? If you draw some pictures and tell a story and tie it together, staple it together, and use it as a picture book, that counts. And we say, well, how does that relate to family SES? Well, not even 50% of families in the first quintile of SES have children's books. Compare that to over 80% in the highest SES group. I don't know if you guys look at this, but often this indicator, whether you have children's books and whether you read to your children, is one of the strongest predictors of children's learning and development. And so researchers love it because we just put one question in our questionnaire and we go, great, we measured the home learning environment. But this is one of the strongest predictors of kids learning in Indonesia. This is just a slide that shows children's development over time. And these are the children who don't go to early childhood programs. So again, if we're talking about the availability of quality, the availability of programs, who misses out? Well, children who don't go to programs on pre-mathematics are miles behind in this study. And we shouldn't be surprised with that because they're also the least advantaged families with the lowest incomes. They live in remote areas. They don't have access to programs. And that's what's in this slide, but no, we don't get to talk about that because I've spoken for too long. But again, I can show you this later on if you like. So, time to wrap up. What are our findings? Well, children from vulnerable backgrounds, low SES backgrounds, are less likely to attend any program at all. They have access to lower quality programs. I put on average against all this because in a presentation in the past I got picked up on it. And I do recognise these are stochastic processes and are not a fundamental truth for all low SES families. These families tend to access programs for fewer hours, and we saw in Australia, even when there's a statutory entitlement to amount of pre-primary programs, they don't even get that. These children tend to have poorer outcomes on average. And so this is kind of, what I've been building up to. It's unlikely that the everyday ECEC system can be effective, right? And I want to come back to this idea of, what is the purpose of the system, right? Are we developing an early childhood system that is there for policy reasons to support the learning and development of all children, to help reduce inequality, or is it just kind of a system that's about supporting children's learning and development? And if you get into a great program, good on you. And if you miss out, so be it. So this is coming back, just again, some concluding remarks. So it's obvious we need to improve the quality of programs. And I think I accidentally said all this earlier. Certainly we need to target areas of most need. And I would argue that if I asked you to think intuitively which neighbourhoods in Montreal need the most support, need extra investment, you can probably come up with a few neighbourhoods, right? We don't need more studies to tell us that. The data probably already exists, but intuitively we know where it is. And because the market is so localised, families are going in their local neighbourhood, we know where the families are as well. So obviously, I think it's completely reasonable to say we need to get away from this kind of lottery system where you kind of win or you don't, and families from the most advantaged backgrounds have a bit of an advantage or a giant advantage. So we need to increase the availability of programs in neighbourhoods that are most vulnerable, increase exposure to quality for those families. And this is kind of where I'm getting at, where I think we need to move the conversation to is, often we talk about accountability of the system, right? And we put the onus on teachers, right? We say it's teachers' responsibility to ensure children learn and develop. But if we've got a system that means families from the most vulnerable backgrounds are accessing programs that are lower quality on average, where there are neighbourhoods with fewer resources, that's kind of the wrong way round. And in fact, our measures of accountability should be about how well do we support and fund programs to be high quality in all neighbourhoods. And in fact, that's a prerequisite before we should put too much expectation on teachers to deliver growth, because we're really setting them up to fail. This is, and I'm sorry I didn't put Canada on this, I guess it would be more provincially oriented, but there is a really good data set that the OECD produce, which is what is the proportion of GDP countries spend on early childhood programs, right? And they break it up by the solid line, which is private investment. That's it. That is how much do families invest through fees, right? And the dotted line, which is how much do governments invest in public investment in early childhood. And I show this in Australia because I'm kind of trying to show this disparity that the investment in OECD countries on average is 0.1% of GDP, but the public investment is around 0.45%. So there's this huge gap between, you know, what parents pays in fees and what countries are putting in through public investment. Mind you, the OECD recommends the minimum that countries should spend on their early childhood systems is 1% of GDP. So we're miles behind, right, across the entire OECD. But this is Australia, right? So in fact, there isn't this chasm between public and private investment. There's a very low public investment and a burden carried by families to make up the difference. I added Indonesia because Indonesia became available in this data set in 2012, again, because I like to show that the public investment in early childhood by our nearest neighbour, a developing country, is very, very close to what we're already spending. And there's a question for Australia about whether it wants to be seen as a country that spends about as much as Indonesia on learning and development in terms of public investment, or one of the OECD countries that we like to compare ourselves to. So I do wonder where Quebec, for example, is on this, and then a bunch of acknowledgements for the studies I showed. So I'm going to wrap up there, and I've shown once again that my time management skills are incredibly poor. I might wrap it up there, and again, thank you very much for staying so long and engaging in such an interesting conversation. I've learned a lot about the system, and I hope that I can come back and hear more. I'm going to finish up now and hand over.
Thank you very much, Dan.